by naming rural women as a distinct population, CEDAW moves beyond the implicit focus of urban populations that characterizes a great deal of contemporary lawmaking. And we see that this definition of rural as an informal definition globally, but accepted as communities of under 10,000 people outside of urban areas is really important. Even though it's not generally recognized as a finite definition in the United Kingdom. We feel it's important to note that the inequalities faced by rural women aren't necessarily unique to rural women. However, it is the rurality which exacerbates inequalities. It's the case for multiple and intersecting challenges faced by many marginalized groups, and a stark example is the lack of access to transport in rural areas. According to recent research carried out by one of our member societies, the National Federation of Women's Institutes of England and Wales, published this year, 47% of respondents have experienced reduced access to basic services, transport services over the last 3 years, and 37% have experienced reduced access to health services, all because of reduced transport services in their communities. Now, we recognise that providing local access to all services and intensive medical facilities isn't practical for small rural communities, but in light of this, it is absolutely vital that adequate transport is available to these communities. So bus services, investment in roads and rail networks, safe and accessible for women and girls, and in particular older women and those with disabilities or increased access needs. The lack of adequate transport options isn't the only factor, but it becomes critically important when cuts to local council budgets, which have obviously been vastly reduced since 2010, and the closure of services specifically for women, such as domestic violence shelters, make the isolation of rural areas a political decision far beyond the geographic one. We are very aware, particularly obviously in the last 2 years, but digital access is another issue which exacerbates the inequalities of living in a rural area. Older women in particular need not just access to internet infrastructure, but training in a sensitive and non-patronizing form. The Office of National Statistics publication on exploring the UK's digital divide shows that there is a disparity between men and women digital skills, which is of course no shock to us, but of those having 0 basic digital skills in 2018, 61% were women. Now, we acknowledge that many families have invested time and effort in ensuring that they stay in touch with older and isolated members of their families during the COVID pandemic, but the lack of digital infrastructure and confidence and literacy means that those users are much more likely to be affected by online issues such as malware, viruses, and indeed fraudulent scams. So that generational divide is narrowing, although women continue to lag behind when numbers are compared. And the Citizens Advice Scotland published a study in 2018, which is the most recent figures, showing that 46% of respondents aged between 65 and 79 had never used the internet. Sadly, and this is a consistent theme when we discuss rural women, that data hasn't been disaggregated by gender or geographic location. From what our members tell us, the biggest issues facing older women in rural communities, undoubtedly isolation and loneliness, further complicated and compounded by all the points we've raised thus far. But in addition, there's a lack of access to high quality and affordable care provision. An adjustment of the pension age has only increased the potential for significant financial vulnerability amongst older women. And again, older women in rural communities face these same issues that their urban counterparts do, but with significantly greater challenges in addressing them. With regards to Black and minoritized rural women, there have been limited studies conducted thus far. The University of Birmingham published a study on the experience of rural Black and minority ethnic community groups in June 2015. This drew out some limited points on specific experiences of women related to systematic and consistent experiences of racism in less diverse communities, but sadly this hasn't been addressed as a more of a priority for data collection. We are very aware that it's not so much that specific groups of rural people or women are more or less disadvantaged, but that the widely acknowledged injustices faced by individuals in the form of racism, sexism, ableism, ageism are all exacerbated by living in a rural community. And as rural women are not protected in UK law outside of CEDAW and are not identified as a protected group or characteristic by the Equality Act, nor do they have the necessary protections in the Human Rights Act. We need full and enforceable implementation of CEDAW, in particular Article 14 in the UK.
Thank you. ACWW networks with societies, different societies throughout the UK, and what particular